Hi everybody, Thomas here. This is just a short video talking a little bit about how to write a philosophy essay. Sorry, someone's car alarm's going off. This video is mainly focused at those who haven't written a philosophy essay before, or have only written a few essays before and perhaps struggled with them. Especially, I'm keeping in mind people who are coming from a different academic background, things like accounting, for example, and coming into philosophy for the first time and being asked to write this roughly 2,000-word essay or whatever the case may be. Anything where you have to form an argument, basically. So there's two kind of areas that I'd like to talk about briefly. The first one is how philosophy papers are similar to papers in other disciplines, and the second part is going to be how they're distinct. The second part's probably going to be more important, but the first part is very important to keep in mind. So even though some of the things I'm going to talk about are going to be pretty obvious, it's easy when you're writing a paper to get lost in various aspects. So keeping these things in mind is going to be important. So the first thing I want to talk about in terms of the similarity between philosophy papers and other academic papers is that, generally speaking, a good essay is a good essay. Obviously, I'm going to contradict that in a minute, but overall, a good paper, it doesn't matter whether you're writing a psychology paper or an economics paper or whatever the case may be, if it's an essay, and what I'm taking to be the point of an essay is to make an argument. So that's what we're doing when we're writing papers and we're making essays, and that should be more or less uniform whatever you're doing. If you're from a discipline that comes from where you're writing papers about something else, engineering and stuff probably does things differently, I've got no idea. If that's the case, then perhaps you want to focus more on academic writing in general and argumentation, and that's a different video. In this video, I take it that you've written some form of argumentative paper, and you're familiar with how to do that in some discipline. And I want to talk about how to bring it over here. So in all those cases, what you're doing is you're putting forward logical premises that lead towards a conclusion. So you want those premises to be as undeniable as you can. You want to reinforce them, and you want to flow through the paper, taking the reader through things they must agree with, you're showing them they have to agree with, till bang, you get to your conclusion. And the conclusion is therefore robust and logically sound, and so on and so forth. Philosophy perhaps is more focused on that logical progression, because logic is one of the main aspects of philosophy. But in general, there's no real difference between writing a paper in, for example, political science and philosophy. I'll use political science a bit in this video. My undergraduate degrees before I specialised in philosophy were in philosophy, government and international relations, so that's what I'm mostly familiar with. So in a political science paper, what you're writing is, even though it's very different in terms of content and other ways that I'll talk about in a minute, to philosophy, there's still those, premise, conclusion, that style of writing. So in order to do that effectively, it's not enough simply to say X, Y, and Z. You also have to do other things like framing the question, saying what you're going to answer what you're going to answer in relation to what aspects of the question, defining terms, all that fun stuff that comes fairly standard in writing papers. In philosophy, and as much as anything, it's very important to define your terms. If you're writing about a specific thing, say bookcases, then you need to say what you mean by bookcase, because a bookcase could just be a shelf, something, or it could be whatever that is, or it could be Gothic architecture or whatever. Defining what you're talking about in relationship to that before you start making complicated premises is very important. But that's if you're familiar with writing argumentative essays, you'll be familiar with that style of doing things, and it's very important in philosophy as well. And other things like clear writing, paragraph formation, sentence structure, all that fun stuff. Don't use long sentences. Make each sentence do one thing. Make each paragraph do one thing. Don't overcomplicate things. These are all very standard things for academic argumentation and academic writing. For all papers, philosophy especially, because if you're coming from a different background, philosophy can be quite complicated, or anything. If you're coming from a different background, anything is complicated. So it's often quite easy to focus on a lot of various things, some of which may be less important than you're aware of, just so that you feel like you're covering all bases. And that if I was going to accounting or whatever, I'd do the same thing. It's perfectly natural. If you're not familiar with the groundwork, you end up perhaps getting lost in all sorts of stuff. So clarity is really important in writing these kind of arguments. You should have a thesis claim that you can answer, there is an answer to the question that should be one sentence. If it's 2 sentences, it's not the end of the world. But if you're really struggling to get it down to that, then you know that without writing anything, you know you're in trouble. Really get simple. So a paper just makes one claim. All the stuff there builds up to make that one claim, to defend that one claim. If you're doing multiple stuff, you're doing too much. Don't do that. It's really confusing to the reader. It's not how you write a argumented paper of any kind, philosophy or otherwise. So, simplify. Each paragraph does one thing in relation to that core claim. You're building up each section of the paper, etc. Everything funnels down. But you should be able to define it in very simple terms. Introductions, conclusions, all that stuff, you'll be familiar with that. If you're not familiar with that, again, if you come from probably a STEM background that doesn't do any of this kind of stuff, then yeah, that's a different video. So that's pretty brief, but these are just things that you should keep in mind, but things you're probably familiar with anyway. Now the important bit. The bit where philosophy is different to other subjects. And this is general, and it's not a law. There's nothing here that doesn't have very clear counterexamples. But just in general, in ways that I think will help you go about structuring your own paper and writing your own paper and proofreading your paper. Proofread your paper. Always proofread your paper. The difference between proofreading a paper and not proofreading a paper in terms of academic marks is almost always a letter grade. Sometimes, when you forget other key things like going back and fixing referencing or whatever, it's more than that. But just in terms of referencing itself and fixing up tiny errors, it's normally the difference between a letter grade. So do that. Sorry, that should belong in the other part, the how academic writing is uniform along various subjects, but how it's different. I don't know why I was talking about that, so I've lost my train of thought slightly. But basically, what I'm about to say isn't always the case. So you have to focus on what you're answering specifically. But in general, the difference between philosophy and non-philosophy subjects is that philosophy focuses on the concepts underneath. So what do I mean by that? Philosophers have a lot of tools in their toolkit, but the main one, the one that unites philosophers more than anything else is, and philosophers are going to disagree on this, is conceptual analysis. The concepts underneath the facts of the case or the incidents we're looking at in the world. So an example of that might be political science. Told you I was going to use political science. So in political science, generally, it's a very broad subject and people do all sorts of stuff in there. But let's say that we were looking at, I don't know, whatever. What's a political science example? You can't use North Korea anymore now that the news has changed the way it has. So let's use fishing or something. Overfishing in Antarctica. If a political scientist is going to approach that kind of question, how best to understand overfishing or whatever, or just exploring that in general as a research question, what they're going to do is they're going to take concepts that have been developed elsewhere and start applying them and digging into the situation, bringing out facts, hoving through data, contacting people, doing research, all this empirical fun stuff, but also just combining stuff and doing standard synthesis that we all do in all of our work, regardless of what the subject is. So finding data from other people who have already mined, going through it, connecting dots and so on and so forth, and then they might look at concepts like, I don't know, power or something. So say there's two states that are arguing about fishing rights, New Zealand and Australia. I've got no idea if New Zealand and Australia agree or not about fishing. But say they don't, then political science, after looking at who's fishing where and doing all that stuff, is going to look at things like power. Like this is not really my area, but Luke's I think is probably the most dominant argument on power, theorist on power. That's probably wrong. Let's say it's true. then they're going to import that concept and apply it in various ways and say, well, what does this tell us about how do we best understand the scenario using this kind of concept? That's the complete reverse of how philosophy works, generally. Philosophy does the concept bit. So it looks at fishing examples between Australia and New Zealand and says, all right, what's going on there underneath all that stuff? What does that kind of argument tell us about power? Or whatever. I'm just using power ratings as an example. So what is the facts of the case? How should we understand them through concepts? We're doing all this stuff so that we can analyze the concepts underneath. And that's important for a variety of reasons. You get these kind of the way people talk about big picture questions in philosophy. Part of that is because when you take these kind of concepts from fairly isolated examples, then if they're correct, you can then start applying them to all sorts of other cases. The reason that it's important is because if we understand how these things are related, then we know a lot more about them. We know how to go about answering questions, fixing problems, all sorts of stuff. And that's really what most philosophers are interested in. It's not what all philosophers are interested in. It's not what all philosophers do, but that's a pretty good rule of thumb in order to understand the difference between a philosophy paper and a non-philosophy paper. So what does that mean in terms of writing? The main thing it means is facts are far less important. They're still important, but they're not load-bearing in the same way. So if my main interest is in power, and I don't really care how many fish are in the sea, or who's doing what, or what war vessel did whatever. I only care about that stuff in as much as it tells me about power. So it's important to talk about, but so let's say 80% of a political science paper works in the world of facts, figuring out all these facts and then applying concepts to them to understand them better. That's reversed in a philosophy paper. In a philosophy paper, it's 20% looking at the facts, and even then, that's probably a lot. So facts are there to frame things, but they're not the focus. The focus is on the concepts. So if we're looking at the ethics of supermarkets, for instance, it's not necessary to spend half your paper. It would be a disaster to spend half your paper looking at the facts of supermarket behaviour towards consumers or suppliers or whatever the case may be. Spending all that time means that what you're not doing in that time is looking at the concepts underneath it. Well, we want to be looking at the things like exploitation and stuff like that. How should we understand these concepts? That's what philosophers are interested in. So when you're writing a paper, the big difference is you want to get the facts right, but you want to summarize them as clearly and succinctly as possible. Say, this is what frames our conceptual discussion later on. That's why it's important. In a political science paper or something else, and I imagine this is probably true for accounting and economics and stuff like that, you spend a lot of time doing the nuts and boltsy stuff of facts in the world. Facts in the world matter for philosophy, but only in as much as they tell us about the concepts underlying them. What we want to do is look at the facts, figure out the concepts underlying them, and then apply those concepts to all sorts of other things to be able to solve these problems elsewhere in the world. So when you're writing, that's a really important thing to keep into consideration when you're coming from a non-philosophical background. Don't spend too long. Also, if you're not comfortable working in this kind of conceptual territory, it can feel like a really good solution to that is to focus on the harder stuff, the nuts and boltsy stuff that you can point to and touch in the real world. That might make you feel better. It's not going to make you feel better when your mark comes back. That's not the way to answer these kind of papers. You have to engage in these conceptual territories. So looking at the literature, figuring out how different people interpret these core concepts, figuring out why they do that, and figuring out how those interpretations have applications in the real world. That kind of stuff's what you need to be focusing on. It really doesn't matter if there's two different interpretations of whether or not Coles buys beef from someone. It's enough to point out that Coles does bad stuff probably, or even if they don't, someone does bad stuff regarding exploitation. In as much as exploitation is the subversion of blah, 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 then we're fine. So, yeah, I don't want you to think that what I'm saying here is that you can be wishy-washy about the facts. A lot of people in STEM think that philosophy is about that kind of wishy-washiness. That's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is our focus is a different thing. Our focus is really specific and very logical and very tight kind of I don't know how to express it, but it's just we're focusing on different things. So when you're writing a paper, it's important that your focus is on the philosophically important material. Okay, so that's the main difference, and it's probably the only difference that I guess I'll talk about at length, because it really is the important one, and that's where most people fall down. I've been talking 15 minutes, and I really didn't want to be talking for much more than 10 minutes, so I'll probably keep it there. But hopefully that gives you a bit of an idea about how to approach these kind of papers. So I mark philosophy papers at university. I read them a lot. These are where people fall down. From a marker's perspective, those things that I just went over are the most important things to keep in mind. The other most important things to keep in mind, obviously, things like the rubric. The rubric's important because that's how all markers mark. If we're marking 50, 100 papers, consistency is the key. So the only way to do that is by going through the rubric. So the rubric should always be next to you, always. Doesn't matter what you're writing. If you're writing in a university subject, or even a high school subject, I guess, anything that has a rubric, use that. Whenever the marker says, I will be marking according to whatever, use that. It doesn't matter how fancy you get otherwise. If it's not according to the rubric, if I'm marking for 12 hours and it's not in that line, that setup, then it's going to go right over my head. Because all I'm going to be asking is, how does that fit up with this? How does the stuff on the paper fit up with the stuff on the rubric? So keep that in mind. So, yeah, in sum, generally, don't be too afraid about philosophy papers. They're just argumentative papers like any other argumentative paper at university. There are differences. Remember that the philosophically important stuff is what you need to focus on. It should be pretty clear to you which is philosophically important and which isn't. Core concepts are really philosophically important. Facts of the case support our discussions of the core concepts. We don't really care that much about the core concepts themselves, especially in the cases we're analysing. We start to care about them a lot more when we start reapplying our concepts to cases in the world, but that's a bit more complicated. And that's a big part of philosophy, but it's not part of something I want to discuss now because that's a really big topic and deserving of its own video, I think. So don't be afraid. Be aware of the differences. Write according to the rubric. If you do that, you should be laughing. The only other tips I can give, reference correctly, start early. Start early and keep going until it's done. Proofread your work, revisit your work, try and explain your arguments. Actually, that's a really good point. I'll just possibly take this up to 20 minutes. One really important trick is to, remember before I was talking about having very clear arguments and having clear premises and clear thesis statements about what you're arguing? A really good way to be clear on that is to explain it to someone else. You know, you often hear, I think it's probably Einstein, I think, said it, if you can't explain it to someone else, you don't understand it. Really good trick. It's really good because you want to understand things, but it's even better because if you're writing something down, it's even harder to be clear than it is to just chat with someone. So if you can chat with someone and do it clearly, it's much more likely that you can write things down clearly. And if it's not clear when you're writing it down, as a marker, I can't do anything with it. It might be brilliant, it might solve philosophy, but if I don't understand what you're saying, then it's not going to go anywhere and you're not going to get any marks. So explaining your argument to other people, just sitting down, even if no one's around, sometimes that's better. I read to the cat. It's very helpful, and he doesn't offer too much criticism. Just reading your work aloud as a proofreading stage, figuring out in your own ear what makes sense and what's clear and what makes sense as an argument as well as individual sentences is really important. So obviously, if you're just down at the pub with your mates, they're probably not going to care too much about your philosophy paper, but working in ways to figure out, to explain to people small snippets is a really valuable method to improve both your understanding but also your argumentative skills and your writing skills. So that's a really good way to kind of do some of that stuff I was talking about before. So now I'll finish rambling now. Thanks very much for sticking with me for the full 20 minutes, if you managed to stick with me. I apologise for the surroundings. This is my home office in the making. So there's bookcases in the middle of the room, which do function as examples when I'm making YouTube videos, but apart from that, it's probably not the best vista for you guys at the other end of the screen. Anyway, thanks very much for sticking with me. Good luck in your philosophy papers in the future, and that's all from me. Bye-bye. No, not bye-bye.